If there's one thing I've learned, it is that we humans are absolutely hopeless at drawing conclusions. In fact, if we're right, it's usually for the wrong reason. That itself is a conclusion. But really, what I'm saying is a hypothesis. A hypothesis is we try to map what we think is happening onto reality. I've been forced to have to do this a lot to escape out of the autistic shell that has encased me for over 3 decades. And so we now can come to a point where I can help others, hopefully. Now we're going to come onto a hypothesis, and this is to do with anxiety. This is an application of basic mathematics to help the autist and potentially family members as to how to deal with anxiety attacks. Okay? Now, we're making an educated guess, let's say, and now we try to map it onto reality. As soon as it doesn't work, we keep testing it, keep assuming that we're wrong. If it doesn't work, we modify it. We try to get as close to the truth as possible, and that's all we can do in reality. Let's begin. Do you ever feel these symptoms of an anxiety attack? We have panic, we have heart rate increase. This is all activated via the hypothalamus in the fight or flight mode. You almost want to either run or start screaming or squeeze your fingers together, which I like to do in private so people don't realize how crazy I am. Okay. Moving backwards and forwards, which is what I'm doing right now, which I didn't realize actually until I said it. You've got the adrenaline rushing through, blood moving away from inessential mechanisms such as digestion, so you might get some stomach pain. I usually get a rip all the way up my right hand side of my stomach. Light-headedness. Okay. Your blood's rushing out to the muscles and moving away from the brain, etc. Fear of the attack itself. This exacerbates the attack. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's called extrapolation. It's where you see a trend and then you automatically extend the trend, but that's actually the wrong thing to do. It's like looking up a mountain and thinking that the mountain just keeps going for infinity. But it doesn't. It has an end. What you don't see, and you must remember, that does exist. Okay? It shall always pass. What I'm drawing here is the threshold. I'm going to draw a more comprehensive graph in a moment. But the threshold is where if you move above that, if your level goes above that, you move into anxiety attack mode. And as you can see, that's the false perception, the dotted line. We think that we're going to keep going up there and I can't take it anymore. But what's really going to happen is that you will reach a critical point. And then, of course, the anxiety attack goes back down. Only once in my life have I withstood the whole attack without having to run away into a quiet space. And that was 2 weeks ago. After 35 years of living on this planet, I finally did it. Punching through that glass wall, forget glass ceiling, glass wall, encased like an eggshell. Okay, here we go. As I said, worsens the anxiety attack. But it always comes back down, always. That's one hypothesis you can realize is inaccurate. It doesn't always increase forever. Now I'm going to zoom out and show you the full graph. The full graph is going to be anxiety level versus time, right? Or whatever you want to call it, time versus anxiety level. Time is the independent variable, and anxiety level is the dependent variable. Okay? It's not necessarily dependent on time, but I'm making this very, very simple. The wave I'm going to draw is sort of what you would imagine the regular anxiety levels are in a healthy neurotypical who has strong family, who can talk about their problems, or has a psychiatrist like I do, for example. Even I'm not a neurotypical, but you can try and live close to that as possible. As we have here the anxiety level, and this is extremely simplified. I'm pulling out one major wave as compared to the millions of little variables that would affect you. A death of a loved one, homework that's due tomorrow, getting sick. Okay, that's the threshold, the same one we saw before. And here is the wave. The average of that wave, right, has a distance away from zero anxiety. Now I'm just drawing the amplitude for you, and you can see it as a positive and negative amplitude. Think of a skipping rope. And B is the average distance to the ground being zero anxiety, which unless you're a robot, does not exist. Okay, now the autist, or the autistic, which I know all too well, faces anxiety at a much, much higher level, average higher level. And that's because it's much more difficult for us to do even the mundane of tasks in the neurotypically designed world. Things like when someone says, "How are you?" that requires a lot of intellectual computation to understand what is really being said. That's because humans have an emotional element to each of their phrases, which I'll get into in another series. For now, let's just look. You can see it's much closer to the threshold. Okay? So the problem is, of course, it's not going to take as much of a hit to the anxiety level for it to go above the threshold. So there's much more chance of having an attack. And so you'll find that the autistic will suffer a lot more attacks more frequently. They're very exhausting. The biggest problem with the attack is that having the attack actually makes the attack worse because of the fear of the fact that it's going to keep increasing. So not only do they suffer more anxiety and more anxiety attacks, but the attacks are even worse than the increase in anxiety should be. You can see with the neurotypical that the anxiety goes up as I've drawn, but there's no panic attack. The autistic there, it's the same height, but you have to add the height to the fear, and you see, and the fear pushes the height even higher. Okay, and that false perception is, and perception actually adds to the real increase, and that's where you can have imaginary numbers adding to real problems, which I won't get into today. So what in the heck do we do? Well, autist, we need to work on reducing the average distance away from ground, from B, okay, from the ground, sorry. So we have to try and reduce capital B and bring it down to as low, as close to small b as possible. And therefore we have reduced anxiety attacks. How do we do that? Well, that is a whole series. It's on its own. But for me, always pushing the boundaries of understanding why the brain wants to cause anxiety attacks, but also remember that it will always pass. It's the first thing you have to remember. It will always pass. It always does. That's all I have for today.